Hey guys, if you're joining now, welcome. Welcome everyone. I can see everyone coming online there. Hi guys. Just wait for a couple more minutes while everyone starts to join. My name's Leola from Hcdx and I'll be your host today. Welcome guys. Lots of people joining. Good to see everyone coming on board. Welcome guys, thanks for joining. If you have any burning questions for our panelists throughout the day, make sure to add them into the chat function or the Q&A. We'll just wait a couple more minutes while everyone still continues to join. I'm Leola from Hcdx, if you didn't know. You can see a couple more people joining. This is exciting. All right. Welcome guys, thanks for coming, welcome. It's the Design Thinking webinar. Welcome guys, just a couple more minutes. Loads of people joining. Welcome everyone. Still more people coming on board. Might get started in another minute. Feel free to pop in where you're from, where you're joining from into the chat. We'd love to chat with you and get you guys in on the discussion. A couple more people joining. Welcome, welcome. All right, guys, I think we might get started because time is precious and I know that everyone is time poor these days. So firstly, thank you so much for joining us today and taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us at the Design Thinking webinar today. I am Leola from Hcdx, and I know that you're not joining to see me, so I will do as little talking as humanly possible. I am here to facilitate our wonderful panelists today. We've got Abby, Stephen, and Hamilton, and I will get them to do a bit of an intro on themselves in just a second. So I guess, you know, in terms of design thinking, I wanted to put this webinar on because design thinking is actually a new course for us. And a lot of our audience, including myself, mind you, I'm a bit unfamiliar with what design thinking is. And according to IDEO, design thinking is a process for creative problem solving. Design thinking has a human-centered core. It encourages organizations to focus on the people they're creating for, which leads to better products, services, and internal processes. And as is the case, my dogs bark when I'm talking on a webinar. Sorry about that. So without further ado, I will hand over to Abby, Stephen, and Hamilton to give their quick intros. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Leola. Just a bit of warning, I've got some construction going on in the background, so if it's distracting, let me know, I'll put a headset in. But as Leola said, my name's Abby. I'm currently a product designer at a digital agency called Kablamo. So we do product development end-to-end, and we're mostly on cloud-based products, but we are very much a design-led organization. And that's not to say that we've got a huge team of product designers. It's actually mostly developers, but where the design element comes in is really all around design thinking and how we creatively tackle problems for our customers. I'll hand over to Stephen.
Thank you. Hi everyone, Steve Graham. Great to be here today. I'm the founder and strategic design director for STIC. We're a strategic design agency, and I am the team. I'm really passionate about how we kind of move from abstract strategies, make them real through the human experience, and that's what we do as an agency, and that's really important because the human experience is the only point in which value can truly be exchanged. Sure, you can do things that create value in the background until a human realizes that value can't be realized, then you can't transfer it effectively. So we'll talk more about that, no doubt, as we get into things today. Over to you, Ham.
Hi, everyone. Hamilton. As Steve said, I work with him at STIC, and my background, I guess, has largely been around probably more from the digital side of things. So my move into an interest in design practices was born from that world. So essentially building teams that were building capability in either digital product, digital design, digital experience, those sorts of things. And then really moving, I guess, out of that environment into either consulting or large agencies. So design thinking has been a big part of the work done and delivered, I guess, increasingly over the last sort of 5 or 6 years. And it's a component part of so much of the design practice and design things that we do at STIC and elsewhere. It's a bit of a focus for us.
Wonderful. Thanks, guys. All right, let's dive right in. So I guess the first question that's on everyone's mind is, guys, what is design thinking? Break it down for me, please.
Who wants to start?
You look like you're going to start.
Sure. So I think, as you mentioned before, Leola, when you read out the IDEO definition of design thinking, often design thinking and human-centered design, or HCD, is spoken about together a lot. Sometimes it's used interchangeably as well, although they are a little bit different. So I might actually start off by talking about what the difference is between design thinking and HCD, because I think it is important to differentiate. So design thinking really is a framework for problem solving. It's a problem solving process. And a few of you might have seen the double diamond. It kind of looks a bit like an infinity sign, but it's 2 diamonds that sit next to each other. And that's sort of the classic depiction of design thinking. There's lots of different ways to visualize it as well. But it is all about, I guess, starting off wide and understanding the current state and gathering all of the information you need to know, and then converging down and asking more the specific questions and working out what is the problem we're actually trying to solve here. And then going wider again and developing some ideas for that solution, testing them, and then converging back again to deliver a solution. Where human-centered design comes in, for me anyway, is it's more of a mindset. So it is an approach to problem solving, but it really is bringing, I guess, the human focus, as Steve was saying, into problem solving. So establishing who your users are or who the audience is that you're trying to solve for, what problems they're experiencing, and then helping find a solution that's targeted to them. So if you use them side by side, you're going to see heaps of benefits.
I like just listening to that. I thought that was a great explanation. That just a couple of things that I'd add that are really critical to think about when you're doing this. I think both human-centered design and design thinking are kind of strongly evidence-based practices. And critically, in either of those approaches, you're unshackling yourself from the expectation you understand the answer up front. So if you contrast that with something like the lean startup approach, where you're going out there with an answer and you're testing, validating that understanding and iterating and pivoting and so on. This is really going, well, actually, we don't know what the answer is yet. Let's take some time to understand holistically the problem that we're solving for and putting people at the center of that. And then delivering iteratively. So really the net result of that is design thinking is a great way to understand holistically and strategize towards what you should deliver. And that's really complementary to, say, an agile delivery approach where you're delivering iteratively. So you're delivering, the smallest increment of value you can each time to de-risk your approach.
And as well, I guess, just to put some extra color on that as well, from my perspective, I think one thing that the framework allows is, because there's that evidence base and it's about quickly surfacing things and raising them, it's a very collaborative sort of process. So your ability to involve people within that from different skills and backgrounds to help, both at the early stages when you're kind of discovering and understanding and sort of widening the net in terms of what are the human factors and contributing factors to the problem that you're looking at addressing or solving. And it really gives a nice ability for other people to get involved in that and contribute in other ways, because ultimately, I guess that just gives a greater richness, particularly when you're then able to start to narrow down back into ideation and things to test and how you're going to do that. It's kind of a crucial element of that. And I think another description that once someone gave me was that it's a very human way to kind of understand and address a problem, because it's very much on, it's almost quite simplistic in the way that it happens, in that it's very much what am I here to understand? What do I need to know? How can I gather evidence to sort of reinforce or change, the views or the things that I'm uncovering, before then going into how might we solve that and what might that look like? And I guess as things are increasingly more complicated, whether it's within organizations or between people and those sorts of things, or technology, creating that sort of baseline for understanding and moving through that understanding with a bunch of people is kind of one of the things I think it's become so popular.
I think it's probably worth saying what it's not as well. Rather than me jump in, I'm gonna handball back to you guys. I have a thought as well.
No, I think that's really important, Stephen. I just did have a question though, another question. So, Abby, you mentioned that it's about trying to answer that question, what is the problem that we're trying to solve? And Hamilton, and, you guys all mentioned that it's all very human focused. When we talk about stuff like, human beings and behavioral psychology and stuff like that, and we all know that everyone's got an opinion, so how do you, kind of get everyone on board to have, to find out what the problem is? Because the problem might be so many things to so many different people. And so, and I guess for me, I don't really understand it. So I wonder, how do you get everyone on board with the same problem, or is there multiple problems?
Go for it, Hamilton.
Okay. I think one of the critical things that enables design thinking to work well is there's probably a bit of work at the beginning of that to really, I guess, articulate what it is you're trying to achieve and who the stakeholders or people might be that could help contribute to either your understanding and comprehension of the problem space that you're in. So, we think about things like stakeholder mapping or engagement strategies, or things that help you understand the context of either typically an organization, because we're usually working for someone when we're doing this sort of thing. But if you're not, it'd be no different if you were doing it for yourself or an internal project. It's really going, who can help with my understanding, who can help with the things that I don't know or need to know. So typically for us, we tend to think about problems where people might have a direct influence on what it is you're trying to understand or solve for, versus those that might be tangential or those that might have an influencing factor. So I think one of the most common challenges with moving through any kind of new process, particularly in an organization, is knowing who's going to support you in that, who's going to potentially need to be involved, so you can create more alignment or more joint understanding. Because I think a big part of that, to that collaborative piece, is you are looking to solve a problem and bring people along for that journey. And because there is that, because you're surfacing evidence as a means of highlighting your understanding, it's a really good way to help influence or get contribution from a bunch of people to help kind of drive that kind of closing single thought. And I think if things go into multiple problem areas and there might be multiple teams working on things, I don't think that can be done too. But we typically tend to think about it as a process you're going through with a bunch of people that you've defined up front and learnt during it who you think needs to be influenced, involved, or input.
Yeah, I think to reiterate what you said, like design thinking is all about collaboration. So bringing multidisciplinary teams together to work on a single problem or multiple. And it really is good for creating buy-in. So as you said, Leola, you know, how do you get people on board? Getting people involved in the process right from the beginning, like really helps them feel heard and understood. And it creates buy-in by getting them involved in solving the challenges that either they're facing or the people that they're serving are facing. I think that's one of the great, I guess, outcomes of using a design thinking methodology.
I don't think there's a hell of a lot to add to those explanations, so I won't. Apart from, I think one of the critical things about the way that this sort of problem-solving approach or framework kind of supports a team in building that understanding, building that buy-in, is that understanding is iterative, and the approach is iterative and recursive. So you get multiple chances to learn and understand, and if you need to, you might have to take a step back in the process to come forward, and you'll go back to people and validate what you understood as correct, rather than assuming that during your interviews or during your research that you've conducted that you were 100% accurate in your interpretation, because of course we're human and we see the world through through our understanding and our own filters of everything and what happens. So it's really critical that we test that and make sure that we're really drawing on the wisdom of everyone we engage and take on the journey.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Abby.
I was going to say, just to add to that, I think design thinking is often spoken about in, I guess, design or creative industries, but it is not necessarily focused towards people that are creatively inclined. And the good thing about design thinking is because it is structured, although it's not linear and there's that iterative process, because it provides a structure, it allows people who might not think in that way typically learn how to build that skill and that approach to problem solving. It's sort of like a safety net, I guess.
And that's a really good point, because I also think that in the process of in delivering through those that framework as well, the way that you're producing and sharing information, you're kind of using all senses. So I think it caters to people of all kind of learning persuasions, because there is some physicality to it. If you're doing workshops and post-its and all the things that we know we tend to associate with that work, but you are producing, you're usually producing something that sort of articulates what you've captured and what you've learned and how that's distilled into insights that might then drive the ideation that you might then pursue. So I do think a lot of people have that perception of like, oh, but is it, that's not, can I do that? Would that work for me, or would that work in my organization? But it's actually covers quite a broad spectrum of people and kind of learning styles, and favors all kinds of people in terms of how they absorb information, and really helps, I think, with the whole buy-in of what it is you're working on.
I think that's a really good segue into our next question. So knowing that, and you guys know that design thinking is not necessarily just for creative types or for designers. So how would you, or I guess, why would you apply design thinking to your organization? Maybe you guys can give, an example of something that you've done in the past or where you've seen it work really well.
So happy to jump in. So I think when I think about, why you would apply design thinking, there's kind of many different avenues that you might start from. So you might not know what the problem you should be solving is, and you'd apply design thinking to kind of first understand the right thing to solve and then solve for it. Or you might have a good sense of what you're wanting to do, and you apply more of a lean design approach where you do, less research, but it's more about iterative delivery and prototyping and understanding, and getting fast to a solution that way. Or it might be about helping an organization to adopt change. So to understand what the human implications of a new technology that's being rolled out, or a big change across the organization. And I guess for that last point, which is an area that we tend to focus on a lot at Stick, we talk about a real gap that we've seen in the market, which is really how do you help drive adoption, help drive and influence adoption of new change, new ways of working, and more service orientated behaviours in organisations. And we've worked with organisations like the Australian Digital Health Agency last year, where we're helping look at the 300 plus software vendors around the country that need to authenticate and access the Digital Health Agency services and provide information. And how do you bring this large group of diverse stakeholders on the journey to adopt these new technologies in a way that the government requires, that is both financially viable and also hits the desirability of how their users are going to interact with the system based on the types of changes that they need to have. So it's just one very small and light touch example.
Yeah, I think you just touched on it there. One of the, I guess, a good reason to use design thinking is really to tackle those sort of like behavioral norms in an organization, and maybe biases. If you're doing things the same way all the time, it's potentially not going to work, and you do need to adapt the way that you work and bring those new ways of working into an organization. And so I guess design thinking is a way to approach and think about problems, or maybe uncover problems that you didn't even realize were there, just to think about delivering a service or a product in a different way to your users. So one example, a few years ago, I worked with a non-for-profit called Fitted for Work. And with any non-for-profit, similar thing, what's feasible in terms of, the type of capital that they've got. They're also, they've got about 15 employees, but 300 volunteers. So their organization is very much run on volunteers, which means there's lots of different people coming in and out of the organization all the time. And they had originally approached us because they wanted to do a big sort of digital transformation. They thought they were falling behind with technology, and that was the solution to all of their problems. And we very much went through just the beginning of the design thinking process. So talking to their employees, talking to their volunteers, talking to their clients that they serve, working out what are those pain points. And at the end of the day, the solution was not about just slapping on another piece of technology, but really about the people and the processes that service the services, and how to improve their ways of working to make sure they leverage what they've got. So yeah, that's also another, I guess, small example of how a different type of thinking like human-centered design can really bring out what the real challenges are for an organization.
So that rings so true, because I think so often if you apply this approach, you're giving yourself license to solve a problem, and it may not necessarily be the problem that you start with, or the solution may not be what you think. And I think so much of what you end up doing is obviously those processes, that sort of approach helps you move in a different direction, with evidence and those sorts of things. I think there was an example from our past working with a big carrier and the freight side of their business, where just to give a very human example, a problem that they had, which was around, how do they ensure that they've got greater accuracy and manifests and things in terms of how they're shipping things all around the world, because there's lots of inaccuracies. And I think the gut assumption was that there was some technology failures or things that could be done better. But one of the best examples that came out of that from an observation point of view was that, it's a highly changeable environment where things can happen. Planes come in late, they've got no control over it. And when that happens, the environment becomes a lot more chaotic and shipments were coming in, people were coming into the front door, putting consignment notes down that weren't then getting entered into a machine because the person literally couldn't cope with the influx and the build up. And then someone would call in and go, where's my shipment? And they'd go, oh, it's not here, but it is, it's just sitting in a pile of papers next to them. And this fairly significant problem, which was costing lots of zeros of issue down the line, was solved pretty promptly and quickly without any technology. As a first step, without any technology, there was just a change in process and approach, and in change in how that was addressed, that yielded some immediate returns that then gave people more confidence in their process, that identified the way the problem was found, and therefore enabled people to continue moving through that iterative process to build out, kind of identify more problems with confidence and go, cool, well, we know that's something we can actually address or change. So I think, yeah, really good point. I think the fact that you might go in with you'll go in with a bunch of expectations, and there's nothing better than watching them all kind of get pushed around and moved aside as the evidence kind of says, yeah, but there's this thing here that's causing real problems and we've all seen it, and you can actually put your fingers on it, and immediately then the people you're taking on the journey can go, cool, but I know how we can fix that. Yeah, which is always a good bit in a project when it happens.
So I think one of the things that you guys brought up there is, you know, when we're talking about design thinking in organizations, you talked about using, you know, a design thinking led approach for change management and digital transformation. Is that the only time that people should bring design thinking into their organizations, or is there other times, or is there, you know, a best time, or is it just any time? I just wonder, do you, you know, for businesses that don't use design thinking methodologies, should they only say, you know, we need to use design thinking now because we're going through a massive change? Like,
I mean, I kind of have an immediate emotive response to listening to that, because it's a classic challenge and a classic thing that people are trying to address. And I think that as a starting point, it depends on what your focus is. So whether it's a large scale transformation or whether you're looking to do something more tactical and pointed. And regardless of those two, I tend to talk to clients about this kind of continuum of certainty of solution. So if you're really certain of the value of creating a solution, then my kind of advice is typically, well, if you know the value of doing it, you know, if you can save someone's life or save $1 million or, you know, whatever it is, well, you should probably just get on with doing it. And that might mean a lean design approach where you do a little bit of research, but you very quickly get into delivery because you've got confidence around that return on investment. Alternatively, if you've got, you know, the other end, which I have no idea, then I kind of tend to say, well, in that case where things are more ambiguous, where things aren't really connected and you're not really sure what your return's going to be, then you should start with a more research heavy and understanding type approach. And therefore it's kind of heavier on the what would typically be termed as like design thinking or human-centered design, which I think, you know, it's part of the toolkit that you pull out to kind of solve against these things. So that's kind of one element that I would definitely kind of encourage people to consider. And then we wanted to sort of pull out an example of where and how you might think of these types of things. I was working with Transport for London a couple of years back, and they had a particular problem. They were doing a mobile transformation of their workforce. So they were empowering their frontline staff with mobile devices, so that they could better have access to, you know, readily have access to information, better digitize processes, like, you know, recording a fault was no longer putting it in a paper notepad, which then gets converted into a form, which then gets sent to someone, typed into a computer, and eventually gets routed to where it needs to go, to automating all of that in a much richer format where you're capturing a photo and other things. As one example of many across the network. As we got into that and we set up a user experience design practice and other things, we ran into this problem internally in the organization around which applications, which pieces of technology do we prioritize for the network to be delivered. And we ran into a problem which is sometimes called, you know, Hippos syndrome. I don't know if everyone's heard of that, but it's the highest individual person's opinion matters most. So, you know, the most senior people, so basically the things that we're getting into our pipeline for delivery and you know, design were the things that the most senior person or the loudest person had thrown over the fence to our team, which meant we had very little control over delivering the things which were going to create the most value for the transport network. And addressing that, we kind of said, well, actually, how do we help understand what are the right things to prioritize? And we started working with parts of the business to do a more targeted pieces of research around the employee experience, which drives the return on investment. So we looked at things like Victoria Coach Station, which is a very contained part of the railway network. It's actually railway network, transport network. It's actually the bus station in the middle of London, and we looked to holistically understand what the experience there is for the travellers and how that's enabled by the employees at the front line and what role digital technology may be able to play within that. And by doing that, we're able to identify what the major pain points were for the travellers and the staff on the platform, the station there, and then prioritize what sorts of things deliver most benefit for encouraging or enabling the workforce to deliver value and make a smoother traveling experience for everyone. And what that really did was that allowed us to then go back to the hippos that were throwing the work to us and go, well, actually, you need to be able to prove, like these other people have, where the value is, and we should do those things first. So there's definitely different ways you can apply this sort of thinking to different types of problems.
Yeah, and I think the main areas where it's helpful, because it's broadly helpful in lots of scenarios, but I think largely it's when there's a job to be done in driving a sort of collaborative outcome, because there are a bunch of people that you need to contribute to and be influenced by the process you're going through in order to arrive at a collective outcome. And I think when the way forward is ambiguous, so to Steve's point, I think there are situations where you can see the value is going to be realized quickly if you just do X, therefore get on with it, versus other times where it's a real case of going, well, there's a few moving parts here. And it doesn't mean that it has to be a massive thing. It just means that there's stuff that needs navigating and things that need to be understood. And do we have all the right information? And are we thinking of things collectively in the right ways? Those are the better times when these sorts of things are going to help you move through those challenges, I think.
Okay.
Tammy's asked a pointed question there. Should we? She's asked, how do you manage when you're dealing with directors and loud people how do you get your design and points across? I think, Tammy, to kind of the point that both Hamilton and Abby made earlier, I think if we understand the environment that we're solving within, so if we've mapped that stakeholder environment, maybe we've done some journey mapping or blueprinting type activities, so we understand how value is created, we can really use that evidence to kind of go, well, actually, this is how that translates to business value. So if we understand who the stakeholders are and what things are important to them in their roles, we can then use the evidence that we've collated to address their needs. So we're not just human-centered in how we create solutions for the users of our products and services, but we're also human-centered in the way that we design our projects and the way that we run our projects. So you almost design the project experience and then the experience that is the outcome of the project.
Perfect. Thanks, guys. So I guess shifting gears here, I'm going to ask you guys, to discuss any real world applications of design thinking that you have, worked on, or, was a success, or, you had challenges with in the past in your own businesses. And it is 11:34, so we will keep these about 5 to 10 minutes each, because I can see there's some really good meaty questions in there and I want to try and get to as many as possible. So tell us about, your experience with design thinking with a practical example that has worked for you guys in the past. Do you want to go first, Abby?
Yeah, sure. I might talk about the project I'm currently working on. So I'm working with a government agency, and they're actually undergoing more data visualization project. And sort of typical with government agencies, they've all been waiting for this project to kick off for a long time. There's a lot of different teams involved, and they've all got their idea of what this project looks like to them and what it means to them. So We've been lucky enough to go through, I guess, the full design thinking process. Sometimes you don't have that luxury of doing a lot of research up front, but we have been talking individually with a lot of different stakeholders, getting a lot of their customer surveys back, and then running a few workshops and bringing them all together. I think the biggest success of this project so far has been creating alignment within the organization. So using this framework, we've gathered all of our information, we've played back what each individual team is talking about, highlighted to them what they're all commonly saying, and then also highlighted what's different. And we're using a lot of these sort of design thinking style workshops to tackle the differences and see if we can get them all on the same page with a shared vision for this project, and also to understand the human-centered design perspective. I guess they've all got their idea of what they would like to see, but for their customers, they're not necessarily thinking about what their customers would like to see. So it is really creating buy-in and highlighting what all parties are trying to achieve through this project. So yeah.
I love that. That common vision, creating a common vision through the lens of the experience of the people you're trying to design for, rather than them as individuals. I'm hearing that. It's the stakeholders. It's great.
Yeah, I think an example that comes to mind for me is one where the problem that we were brought in to solve, and this is quite a common thing, like we're usually involved where there might be a scenario where there's like, it's typically about a piece of technology that's going to help, overcome an issue or solve a problem. And it was very much around how an organization was getting ready for the arrival of that piece of technology. And in the process of really at the point where we'd sort of identified what the challenges were with creating the experience to support that technology enablement from all the various voices, and very similar to Abby, to your example, I think getting lots and lots of people who had disparate views and opinions who hadn't necessarily been consulted or considered in the process leading up to that point. What it created, which was a real byproduct, was not only did it elevate, I guess, and expose the project to a broader audience and help people sort of attach to the solution because they had a hand in it, made a very significant difference, not just in then arriving at what the outcome would be and how they would do it, but in the subsequent rollout of that tech, the adoption and use of that was proportionally, I think they used the word significantly higher than previous projects where they'd done that. And really, whilst there were elements of design thinking in helping shape what that experience and engagement would be, it really had it just had an added benefit of not just answering the question of what is the right experience and how should it be supported, but had all these people that by the time it actually happened, because the experience had been shaped by them, you had people advocating for it. And I'm not being, not crazily, it's not like these people going, oh my God, this tech's amazing, but they were using it and they were overcoming problems that previously they would have just swatted it down in an instant and gone, see, this is ridiculous, it doesn't work. They were actually able to move through those early bumps and things with a lot more conviction because they could see what it was and the hand they had in it. And I think another part of that same project that I thought was really useful from a design thinking point of view was when it came time to prioritizing what things we were going to address in the experience. So we'd gone through obviously understanding and defining, and we were in this sort of ideation space. We went through a bunch of how might be scenarios and sort of got people to sort of ideate from the broader team, not just obviously us, but the wider organization that were involved that we identified in stakeholding. And the process of them sort of picking which ones they liked and why, with an obvious bias towards the things they knew could be done versus the things that might be, take too long or be too complicated or too far, just meant that a lot of people, I think, who came into that process going, oh, this is just going to be a bunch of stuff where we throw stuff on a wall and then everyone forgets about it 3 days later, walked out with a lot of confidence going, cool, well, those I get how we can solve those problems, and you actually listen to me. And that was, I think that's a real strength of following that kind of approach.
I think that it really reinforces the important role of change management practitioners. And I think that, you know, of late that, you know, in some you know, organizations, they've kind of ended up with a bit of a, you know, it's been a bit of a dirty name to kind of have that. But I think that practice and that capability is so important, but it focuses on kind of the change rather than the result of the change, the outcome. So I think when you combine that change management practice with something like design thinking or human-centered design, you focus more on the influence and adoption of the, you know, to drive the outcome that you're after. And that's the intersection of those things that brings the real wealth of what we're able to deliver there that Hamilton was talking to.
That's great, guys. Thank you. We do have a lot of Q&A questions and some real meaty ones in there as well. So I might just go through and I'll ask a couple of the questions. Feel free, panelists, to jump in if you guys have the answer. But I've got one here from Rush Pathak. I'm going to read it out. It sounds as though design thinking in HCD requires a cultural change within an organisation. While attempting to shift culture across an org and discussing with C-suite to make this change, what resources, people, tools and processes does an organisation need to support this cultural change? How can I get this across the line with the suits upstairs? Thank you. Oh, and she says, sorry, it's Vinaka, and I'm from Fiji, so that's it. That means thank you.
That's a big question.
It is a very meaty question. I like it.
I think one way to start introducing design thinking in an organization is to start small. And I think we've all sort of touched on this idea of a toolkit. So yes, design thinking is, it's a framework, it's a process, it's got steps, it's iterative, but it also comes with this massive toolkit that you can use. So maybe instead of, you know, trying to write some big proposal and present on it and advocate for it, pick something within that toolkit that you can use on a small scale within the organization and then show its value. So as an example, you might run an ideation workshop with a few different people from different teams to talk about how we improve our internal communication strategy or something like that. Something that doesn't necessarily have to be a big meaty thing, but just shows the value of some of those tools that design thinking brings, and you know, show the people up there the value of that.
It's funny, Abby, I absolutely agree that can be a good idea, but there's some inherent risk within that sort of approach, especially, you know, the C-suite of organizations. You know, they've been going off and doing design thinking type courses for, you know, I remember I was working for Deloitte a decade ago and they sent the entire executive of Deloitte Australia to Stanford D School. So, and you know, that's 10 years ago. So over that period of time, organizations of varying sizes have got exposure to these things. And in some organizations, especially the larger ones, there is almost this bit of, you know, it can have a negative effect when you try and just expose them to ideas. If they've seen them before, there can be this sort of innovation theater sort of, you know, look, we're doing something fancy sort of feel. And, you know, it could be absolutely the right thing to do for the people on the tools. But if you're trying to influence up, I think you need to be mindful of what is the right thing to do to deliver that first increment of value that Abby was referring to. And that might absolutely be the right thing, but also you might be better off to, you know, as someone had said in the chat, you know, bring, I should refer to who it was, Kylie said in the chat that, you know, bring it to life through proven case studies, bring it to life through the value of design, proven in terms that, you know, those executives, those business people think about these things. And the other thing, depending on the level of influence and power and, you know, support you have from people in the organization, is what is a small targeted piece of work that you can perform that shows how this is different to how you've been working previously in the organization, so that you get that internal case study as well.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. All right, so we've got one here from Marvin. I love how design thinking as an ideology doesn't necessarily preach itself as a dogma and is quite open-minded to evolving design thinking itself. what have been some recent trends and game changes, gradual or abrupt, that you've seen in industry from its roots in the scientific method to IDEO Stanford to today and in the next few years?
So
Another meaty question.
yeah, they're great. They're great questions.
They were big ones.
Yeah.
Good.
I think one thing, I can't necessarily talk to experience outside of Australia more recently, but I think mostly what I'm seeing is I think the acceptance of design thinking, you know, as a thing and not a fad, has definitely happened. Doesn't mean there aren't naysayers. So I think the general acceptance and value seen of it for it within a commercial and business context and a government context is definitely improved immensely. There's a lot less. It doesn't mean it's therefore simple to get it up and running in a place that doesn't have it, but it feels like there's a broader acceptance and understanding of it. I mean, I love the fact that I've got a 12-year-old daughter who's already can tell me about it because she's being taught about it in school and stuff. So I think it is definitely there's a more stable platform from which to talk about it. I think how that evolves over time, because I think, you know, Steve used the word innovation theatre, which I guess is the counterpoint to people effectively using these tools to using them negatively when they might generate a lot of noise and colourful outputs, but don't actually deliver change or impact. I think businesses are better able to identify and adapt those practices to suit the organisation and the environment. So I think even the things that we get asked to contribute to now, it's very rare that someone's saying, hey, we need to build this practice as a function from the ground up. It's usually we understand how design principles may help us in this area, and human-centered design might help, or design thinking might help. So I think the easy answer, and absolutely not the whole answer, is that I do see that more and more people, as this becomes a more standard way of addressing and solving problems, because the benefits are becoming more widely reported and seen, just means that I think businesses will start to see more of it as a general standard approach to addressing particular problems or challenges, or way to breaking down silos. And so yeah, I just think a broader acceptance and more use, and therefore how that matures and what it turns into, yeah, not sure, but it'll be interesting to see.
I think there's been some milestones on that journey that Ham's describing. So rather than reiterating the point, I think that if we look at around the world at large organizations and their buy-in to this, I think that we saw from about 2013, 2014, the large consulting firms around the world start to do large acquisitions in this space, and they've all made acquisitions of smaller consultancies that are working this way, and it really challenges the heart of how these strategic consulting firms have delivered on problem solving, or at least they're trying to. Having spent a decade in one of them, I'd say trying. And yeah, to varying levels of success. And that's really a kind of, they see the value of this, the value of it's being realized in many organizations. And then other milestones along the way, we've seen the value of design being quantified. So McKinsey did some great work, and they've published some reports. So I guess we could get it in the notes that go out after this to kind of share some of that. And there's been some others that escape me right now, but there's been some really clear points that show that this is on the uptick and on the rise.
Yeah, I think to add to that, I know that IBM have developed their own sort of design thinking framework, and they've got some really good statistics around, something like a 75% uptake in products that use a design thinking methodology, and a 300% returns for organizations that use it. Those sort of big numbers. I think that talks to the previous question around how to get our C-suite to listen. Go out and have a look for those big statistics, because it is what C-suites look at, are those hard numbers.
Definitely.
IXM from the IBM initiative, they had a huge, and Abby's right, like they were really interesting, because they started from basically a few designers in their organization, and they came out in the public a few years back and said, we're going to hire 1,000 design thinking experts in the next year, and they did. And that's kind of another, like, that shows the growth of the space. When we go sort of 5-10 years ago, there weren't that scale of people practicing design thinking more broadly than product-based design, like user experience design.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, guys. I think this is actually a really important question, especially for those people on that are not from design backgrounds. It's from Reshma. What are some of the ways we can make the participants in a design thinking workshop build empathy towards the users for whom we are trying to solve the problem? Because as mentioned earlier by the panel, not everyone is from a creative or design background.
So many answers for that one. I will try and be brief. From my perspective, there are a bunch of tools that help you demonstrate the experience and the life of the people that you're designing for. And there's schools of thought on which ones work and which ones don't, which one's better. But I think putting all of that aside, it's your job in that approach and process to really help create that understanding and empathy. That's kind of one of the biggest elements that you're trying to deliver in that. And I think because the way that you gather the information that you're then going to relay would be everything from, doing observation to in-field research to watching and all those sorts of things. And those things can be brought to life with video and stories and snippets and anything that I think the more time that you spend in delivering to answering that challenge, that sets you up for everything else, because so much of what you're doing in this process is trying to help people to understand. And the more that you can do for that, great. There are examples I've got where we've had detractors within the process and the way that we've helped overcome those, because we were bringing back evidence and there was a lot of like, oh yeah, whatever, that's rubbish. He said that for these reasons and it's typical. We had to take this person on a couple of those research exercises and set up the participants with full understanding why. And it took that much to convince them of the way people were thinking and talking, and it absolutely helped change their mind. So in extreme examples, you could literally get them involved if that was possible, because it's very easy to sort of take pot shots and things from within a workshop environment to go, oh yeah, but how many people did you speak to? Like 5, 6, not 3,000. And yeah, it's a really fun part of the job actually, is watching people's perceptions shift on that stuff, because it's such an easy thing to sort of go, and such a common organizational practice for people to just go, well, I know, because maybe they came up through the business where they did have access and understanding of customer, but that was 10 years ago, is probably the most common thing. Oh, I know how it is. Well, you did, but maybe you don't now. So I think using any of those tools and evidence as ways of trying to help influence is the more you can share and the more you can get them in those people's shoes, the better.
I think
I 100% agree. That anything you can do to close the gap between your stakeholders and your users or your customers is paramount. And I'm a big believer in, if you've got a service owner or a product owner, that they need to be a part of the research. They need to have skin in the game, and they need to meet those customers face to face wherever possible. And if you think about that from a broader project context, how do you bring that into your workshops? Then that might mean bringing your customers or your users into the workshops that you're running, and allowing the participants to interview and engage with them directly. And then there's all of the techniques you can use if that's not possible, that sort of just move you away from the customer side.
And I think a really obvious point is at the end of the day, everyone is a user of something. Everybody has experienced a service. Everybody uses a product. Everybody's experienced challenges with change. So whatever problem you're solving for, and the people that are involved, and you're trying to help them build empathy with the people that they're serving, or the users that they're serving, find a like example that they may have experienced before to help them see the similarities. I think in design, sometimes we talk about like analogous designs. So you look at 2 different products or 2 different services that are from completely different industries, but are delivered similarly, and bring out those similarities. And it just helps people, I guess, empathize and understand with what their audience might be going through.
And one very final small point I would say, and not that I'm advocating you do this in every instance, but one really important thing is when you're building your stakeholder thing, if you get something from the client that says, don't speak to those people, that's usually an indication that that's where there's some really good stuff going on. So sometimes it's better to seek forgiveness. yeah, that's, and there's, I mean, I had an example where we did that and we found a way to speak to those people in a way that was not too controversial. And lo and behold, the question that everyone wanted answers for was when we had spoken to that group, everyone was like, but what did they want? And what did they say? And it ended up being some of the most valuable stuff. So there was a willfulness not to listen to those voices. And then when we bought them anyway, they just didn't have a choice.
I think the key there is that, you know, you've got to consider all users, you know, not just the ones that you think it's impacting. So I think that's a really good point, Hamilton, and great answers, guys. Thanks. All right, so another one here from Anthony. How do you draw out information from stakeholders who are introverted or resistant? These types of personalities tend to let their extroverted dominant stakeholders speak out on their behalf. I think you guys touched on this a little bit earlier, talking about loud stakeholders.
Yeah, I guess the opposite to loud stakeholders is sometimes people that are unwilling to talk to you. It really is about building rapport, and I think that's why the research or discovery part of design thinking is really important. The example I talked about previously, where I worked with a non-for-profit, we talked with their volunteers, and the volunteers really didn't want to have a chat to us. They had voiced that they talked to people previously and nothing had happened. They didn't feel heard. No actions came out of it. And it did take a lot of work to get them engaged and get them openly talking to us about the types of things that they were experiencing. And that really was just putting in the hours to build rapport with them. So talking to them as a group and trying to build that rapport. And once they felt comfortable, having a chat to them either one-on-one or in pairs, so that they, I guess, were talking about their own personal experiences, and they're not shadowed by those louder voices in the room, or you're experiencing anchoring bias. The one person says something and everybody just agrees or says the same thing but in a different way. So yeah, it can be tricky, but it really is about putting in the time and the hours, I think.
I think that adding to that, there's a lot of craft that you can develop in yourselves in terms of how you engage, in terms of your research. So yeah, really honing your skills around reading body language and signals, and understanding what's being said between the words that you're hearing. And that's all research technique, and kind of continuing to ask questions of the people that aren't immediately going to tell you, and being sensitive to how they're feeling as you do that is definitely at the heart of that. And I think when you then take that sort of way of working from a research lens and you apply it in workshops and things, it's about conducting activities in a way that allows you to draw on the introverts and the extroverts. And a really simple example of this is we've all heard of brainstorming, and everyone's yelling out what they're thinking. They're all talking, and that obviously dominant extroverts are going to lead the charge on that sort of thing, and the introverts might shy away. But if we do things like brain writing, which is where you get everyone to be quiet and write down their ideas and comments and thoughts, and then you go around and create a more structured way to get everyone to speak, then you can draw that insight and intelligence and wisdom from the whole of the group. And obviously there's a myriad of different ways that you can deliver to that.
Wonderful. All right, another one here from Marcus. What importance do you feel designers should place on marrying data with their research of a problem, especially in the presence of hippos? I don't know what hippos is, so I'm just going to read it as I say it. I'm sure it's something that designers understand and not actual hippopotamuses, to help balance the subjective human impact with objective and business impact.
So just the hippo thing, highest individual person's paid opinion matters most. So hippo.
I've never heard of that. I'm learning something new every day. Sorry, guys, go ahead.
There's also a bunch of other animals you can look up, like rhinos and others, which we can send. There's a great little graphic online around them. So I think in terms of how you marry your qualitative research with your quant, if I'm understanding the question correctly, I think it's really critical of, depending on, understanding the problem that you're solving in context. So it's not just all about understanding of the users, and that can absolutely have quantitative insight around it. But it's also, we often talk about that as desirability, but it's also important to understand, what are the organization's imperatives around what they're trying to do and why, and then any limitations that may exist in terms of policy or technology and other things, and what we always say, align that to the purpose of the organization or the mission of the project you're working on. So I think you've got to balance those things, and then think about, when you're thinking about those things in a balanced way, understand who your stakeholders are, who is it that you're trying to influence and why, and how do they operate, so that you've got the right information for them for what they need it for, so that you're not talking cross purposes.
Wonderful. Great. Got another one here. I think this is actually a really great one. When validating problems, how does an organization know that they're asking the right questions?
So I'll have a go at that one. I think one of design thinking's benefits is that it is, I think, Steve might have mentioned at the beginning, I think that we often talk about the fact that you want to proceed unencumbered with a preconceived answer, and it's no different with identifying the problem. So if you're able to build understanding as a means of the basis for your then decisioning around what it is you're going to solve and ideate, then a lot of the time you are actually going to go in with a problem or an idea of what you think that solution might be, but you'll actually find through the process you'll uncover other things, and therefore you may end up addressing something that you didn't necessarily intend to, because the evidence has taken you there. So because you're bound by the evidence and you're responding to the evidence as you learn and understand and uncover. I think when we're doing commercial engagements with third parties, and I'm sure it's no different for Abby, 9 times out of 10, you can't necessarily start by saying to someone, hey, we'll have a go and we'll see where it takes us. Even though in truth, that is kind of what happens. You've got to put some other language around that to make people feel comfortable. But I think the strength of design thinking, one of its biggest strengths is that that it's going to push you towards solving. It's got a higher chance of pushing you towards solving the right thing, not just necessarily the perceived problem.
I mean, I think there's some inherent challenges with that, and then running projects, because projects typically, or historically rather, have started with an understanding of what the solution is, and you get a very clear run at, these are the things we need to do. Whereas when you start with the problem, it's a little bit more ambiguous, it's a little bit more messy at the beginning, and that's why things like the squiggle that people might be familiar with shows like the recursive and iterative way that projects work through what appears initially to be a linear process. And I think that when you're doing these projects, or when you're in your early projects that you're attempting in this way, you need to appreciate that things are going to get more uncomfortable before they get comfortable, and that has a sort of exacerbated or accentuated feeling for your stakeholders, because if you're going off and learning more about trying to understand what the solution is, you kind of, until the point that you start solutionizing, which if you think about the double diamond is halfway point. And I'm not saying that's how you run your projects. It's not as clean and simple as that. But if you just, for the sake of the example, think about it that way, until you get halfway through your project or your effort, you're going to be in the problem space, and you're going to be feeling, learning more about what you don't know, and you don't know what you don't know. And as you learn more about what you don't know, you learn there's more things you don't know, and you explore. And until you reframe that problem and start solutionizing, you're not going to have comfort. But those people that are, at arm's distance from you, feel like you've gone off, you're not giving them confidence on what the solution is, and you're not able to do that until you're further into your solution. So there's this management of how those projects feel for your stakeholders, and the need to manage that consciously. That is a real skill that needs to be developed around how you deliver this sort of change.
One, I guess, small part of this, and an example that I sometimes use, is when doing one-on-one interviews with users or stakeholders. When you first go into your first ever interview or workshop, you've got a list of questions you want to get down, but you've got no idea if those are the right questions to ask. So rather than listing those questions, I often draw a bit of a mind map and start to put themes together that I want to hit. And maybe there's some questions that I must ask. But as the interview goes on, I start to add things to that mind map and make sure that those themes or ideas are then asked at the next interview. And it just makes sure that that process continues to evolve and is not stringent. And you're not just continuing to ask the wrong questions for every single person that you talk with.
I think that's really great. And I think what I'm hearing from everyone is that you don't know what you don't know. And, you know, when you start in the beginning, there might be a set of questions that you think you need to answer. And then you do your research and you do your I'm so sorry about my dogs, by the way. And you do your due diligence. And then, you know, you get to a point where there's other questions to answer or other people to do research on. So I think that's really important. The next question we have here, I think, is a much longer winded answer, but I might ask you guys to contain it. How do you plan the design thinking process implementation from a timeline and scope perspective?
Yeah, it's a hard one to give it's a highly contextual answer, because I think, and we spent a lot of time figuring out what the boundaries are there, but very simply as you can say it, it's bound by time and people. So how much time are you willing to invest in this? How much time are you willing to spend discovering and exploring the problem? For us, for whatever reason, and this isn't a design thinking thing, but in terms of us typically applying these approaches within organizations, it ends up being for the first part of the process where you're delivering prototyping and doing those sorts of things, it typically tends to spend between 6 to 12 weeks, roughly, to give enough of a breadth of understanding to traverse a largish organization. But obviously it can be contracted either way. So it's really, for us, it's who are the stakeholders, who's involved, how much time is needed from them. And then it's a process of then really project managing that out and reviewing it as you're burning through the project is the simplest answer I can think of.
I think there's some key variables to kind of consider when you're making those decisions around what Hamilton was talking about. Now my very talkative cat is going to come in and join us. Sorry. But yeah, if we think about like the certainty of solutions, so where are you starting? Where's the focus of your work? If we think about the complexity of the stakeholder environment and the maturity of the people you're engaging in terms of, do they understand what working this way means and how much effort's going to be involved with bringing them on the journey compared to people that are really fluent in this way of working who are going to be happier and more comfortable for you to be a little bit more informal with things. If you consider those sorts of variables, I'm sure there's more that the guys will add, that you're definitely going to do a better job of scoping those things, but there's no one size fits all or cookie cutter approach that we can give you, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think you guys have pretty much covered it, and I was just going to reiterate, unfortunately, it just depends on the project. And as you said, Steve, like there is no cookie cutter approach, and the more you do it, and the more, I guess, projects and industries you work in, you'll get a feel for the length of time, the buy-in that you've already got, the involvement you've got from stakeholders, how much money they want to throw at this, how much access you've got to users, all those sort of things play a big role.
Cool, thank you. Alrighty, if design thinking is meant to be research heavy and having broad understanding of a product at the start, what are some of the research methodologies and studies that you have conducted, and how long did they go for? It seems most of the talk is around stakeholder management and workshopping to bring teams together instead of actual research. So if we can talk a little bit about research. Thank you.
I don't just to challenge that slightly, I don't think you can, depending on what you're designing for, like if you're designing kind of at systemic change levels, and a lot of the conversation today has been around that, I don't think you can disassociate stakeholder research and understanding and management with user research. So just as a kind of a point of facts around that, absolutely. But then if you think about research more broadly, I'll talk about my favorite of the project, because this project's always one that I get excited about. A few years ago, I was fortunate enough to be asked to help Her Majesty's Prison and Probation Service reimagine how they deliver, enabled by digital technology in particular. And that was because at the time in the UK, well, England and Wales specifically, there was 85,500 people incarcerated across 100 plus institutions in England and Wales. And they were reoffending at a rate of 44.7% within 12 months. So imagine two people walk out of prison and one goes around the revolving door and walks straight back in within that 12-month period, which had huge costs to the UK as a whole, and obviously a whole host of negative ramifications. So within that, we're looking to understand what is the psychology of rehabilitation and what's influencing that, and why are we getting such a poor rehabilitation rate, or inversely reoffending rate. And to do that, we undertook a bunch of research. So we looked to understand a lot about, by interviewing key stakeholders. So just start with that point and mapping that stakeholder environment, understanding, how many prisons were out there, what's happening in each of those, how they vary. We spoke to people that were experts in understanding the psychology of rehabilitation. So we spoke to professors at various universities who were conducting studies, and we read their studies, so a whole heap of desktop type research. And then we looked out at leading practice around the world, both from influencing change and also to what are the leading prison approaches in the world. So Norway have the leading prison system, and they have very few prisons now because of it, and very little reoffending. And then what we did was we did a whole host of research over the period of a couple of months, where we were going out to prisons and we were interviewing prisoners, and we were conducting workshops or focus groups within prisons, and we were doing a whole heap of observation around the prisons themselves, which was both fascinating and terrifying. I loved it, but it was definitely outside of my comfort zone. But I can say I've been to prison now. Although one of the things we had wanted to do that we didn't end up getting the chance to do was we were invited to do overnight stays in the prison cells along with the other prisoners, which I really would have enjoyed. And I think that research, and those were the types of research activities, and we did a whole heap to synthesize that understanding and make meaning from it through mapping and other techniques, which I don't think you can dislocate from the research itself, because by making meaning you identify gaps. And we went back and did some more research, and I'm sure I've forgotten things and activities we did there, but that's at the heart of that project, and building that understanding was a lot of travel and in-person research in the context, like in the situation where people are going through these things, and absolutely fascinating.
I'll just add to that. So when I started working within this industry, I started off as a user researcher, and it actually come from a background in psychology. So I studied psychology, and I was involved in a few research projects as well. And in the beginning, I struggled quite a bit because I'd come from that academic style research. And although we did do qualitative research as well, it was always using, statistical analysis programs, and it's in a very different nature to the type of research that you do within the UX UI space. So at first I was very much like, this isn't research, what are we doing? But the more that I discovered the different types of research you can do within this field, the more, I guess, because there's less constraints, you can really uncover such a wide range of topics from such a broad audience. So we started off doing, a lot of sort of one-on-one interviews and surveys. We did some contextual inquiry and observational research. So watching people within a space that were involved in a service and seeing how they interact. We did quite a bit of like modeling of physical spaces. So, if you're trying to design a bank teller or something like that, you sort of model the space, and then you watch people walk through it, and you've got sort of different things that you need to tick off. But there's so many different, I guess, ways that you can conduct research. It's not just stakeholder interviews and workshops. Definitely do a Google of things, as there's so many things out there and they're really, really cool.
I think the other thing is that, you know, when you're doing your research, like we would typically separate research and validation and prototyping as they're all kind of research. Like they're all things that help you develop understanding. But there are different things that we talk about within those areas. And I think, you know, you can even split out research based on the type of relationship they have to the work, whether they're a stakeholder or a user or something else. So they are primary, you know, research participant or not. And I think the other thing that comes to mind, which is really important, is this question of, you know, when I was listening to someone's trained tradition, you know, so traditionally academically and in ways of doing research, which is, you know, such a huge plus when you're doing this sort of thing. But when you're doing it from a commercial perspective, and a lot of what we do, whether we're working public or private, it's largely, you know, you've got a limited envelope of funding that you can deliver against. You need to be really pragmatic around how much do we need to know to get to the right next step. So how much research is enough research to then say the next best investment of the money or the time or whatever is about designing and delivering and testing. So it's kind of constantly trying to balance those things. And the rule of thumb is that you've probably done approximately enough research when you're constantly hearing the same things over and over.
Yep, that makes sense, guys. Thank you. So there are a couple of questions there that we won't get to answer. So we'll start to wind down now. The last question that I've got from the audience that I think is actually a really great question is, what are the pitfalls, if any, of design thinking? I think that's a really good question, and I'd love to hear from each of you.
Okay, I'll just jump in and get my bit said. So I think the biggest pitfall with design thinking is if design thinking is run in a context that's typically within an organization, I'll tie it to that. If it's not managed or run in a way that sets it up for success, because people are sort of maybe halfway there on their understanding, or they're using little bits of it or whatever, and ultimately as a result don't deliver value, because, you know, enough evidence isn't uncovered, or people aren't influenced, or things aren't driven the right way, you can really set yourselves up for any future work in that space becoming far more difficult. So much of the work that we come up against is often, yeah, we tried that and it didn't work. You know, but what do you mean you tried it? How did you try it? What did it look like? What were the outcomes? What were the expectations? What did they actually deliver? What wasn't delivered? So I think, you know, create an environment where you can learn that's safe until you get enough muscle to then take it out into the open world where you're going to use it, where there's going to be a bit more eyes on and maybe more focus and attention paid. But I think, yeah, if you can't communicate the value during that process and what you're doing, that's probably your biggest risk, in my opinion.
I think something I've seen a lot is, I guess, just to reiterate what you've said, is just because you've run one workshop doesn't mean you do design thinking. So I think just playing on that, you know, just because you think you've done a part of it, or you say that we talked to a couple of employees and now this solution is human-centered design, doesn't mean it actually is. And there's a real danger in preaching that you do it when you don't. And that's when you often find disgruntled employees or users that, you know, hear that you said that you've done something and they haven't felt heard or felt part of the solution.
So true.
Yeah, it kind of makes me think about returning to Australia a couple of years ago when I first met the guys from Academy XI and was talking about doing a course, and I was a little conflicted, I've got to admit, of whether I should teach or not. So I really believe in the democratization of design, and people should use, and we should be more human-centered in our decision-making broadly. But I was really concerned equally that by going and teaching more people service design and user experience design and things, that we were actually diminishing the value of craft and how people work, and we should be really prizing that. And in the end, I I kind of recognize that actually the first point needs to be balanced against the second. There's almost like a harmony to be found between them, and they shouldn't be opposing forces in a negative way. And that's the big thing the big risk I see with design thinking is that people don't properly acknowledge what it is and value, what it is and how it's done, and therefore they use it as for things like innovation theatre, and you lose the real value that can be created because it's undermined before it gets started.
Yeah, great. Thanks, guys. I think that was a really important question. So thanks for asking. And just finally, before we close out, guys, I want to know if you guys can give us or give the audience one thing that you value of design thinking. So whether it's one thing that you guys will always do when you're in the process, or one thing that, users outside of the design space can take away from design thinking. I really understand that's a loaded question, but hoping you guys can do your best.
So I think I sort of already said it in one bit where I talked about my favorite bit. And I think my favorite bit is when you have reached a point where you've helped someone understand enough about what's being uncovered and the problems that are being addressed for people who are potentially naysayers now going, I get it, I see. And it's because you've created an environment where they can then occupy someone else's shoes, and it changes their perspective. And that's probably the most satisfying for me, most satisfying outcome of that approach. And I think probably some of the most useful bits of it.
I think for me, the biggest thing is to, not just think about the user experience design for the problem you're solving, but also design that project experience so that it's a fun and engaging thing to be a part of, because project participants are humans too.
A more personal one for me, I guess, is having come from a background in psychology. I never thought of myself as a creative person, but I also love solving problems. And I don't think I realized I needed that creativity until I came across design thinking and realized the world that it sort of opened up for me. So for me, it is about getting that my creative juices flowing, I guess, when it's not when I'm not typically a creative person.
That's so great, guys. Thank you so much. Thank you, Abby, Stephen, and Hamilton for joining us today. I do hope that all attendees found that really valuable, as valuable as I found it. So thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you also to the people that wrote your questions in. They were really fantastic questions. Just before we go, don't forget that, Academy XI, we do a design thinking course. It's a part-time Elevate course, and you guys can learn all about the methodologies and way to scope your research and all that kind of stuff in our course. So feel free to email me at leola@academyxi.com if you have any questions. And we also have, for those of you that asked about stakeholder management, we do have a B2B course on customer centricity. So feel free to ask me about that as well. Again, this recording will be sent out to you guys by tomorrow. And Abby, Stephen, and Hamilton happily share their email addresses as well. So we'll share those again if you guys wanted to reach out to them directly. So thank you very much, guys, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks for hosting.
It was fun.
Thanks, everyone.
Ciao.